So good morning, my name's Paddy Nixon. I'm the Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Canberra, and I'm here this morning to talk to Michelle Grattan about the week in politics. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Paddy.
An interesting week, Michelle. The government has been starting to trickle out some of the hints about the budget. We've had some indications on reform of insolvency laws to support small businesses through this COVID world that we're living in. We've had also some indications of investment in NBN, and then pointers towards clean energy future and economies around 5 technologies. And that with the backdrop of 2 former Prime Ministers entering the political fray. Very interesting week.
Quite crowded.
Quite crowded indeed. So yesterday, Frydenberg started to set the scene for his budget on the 6th of October, and he indicated that the economy would be some 6% smaller by the middle of next year. And he indicated that he wanted to preference economic recovery over budget repair, and indicated that economic recovery was something like unemployment being comfortably under 6%. What do you think he was pointing to?
I think his messages were, firstly, that the economy is in for a rough ride for quite a long time. As you mentioned, it'll be 6% smaller than was forecast only at the end of last year. So a big change in a short time. And also, of course, migration has stopped, and that means that the growth that we get from migrants coming in, who tend to be younger and workers, will be cut back, won't be there for a while. So hard times to come was one message. But the other important thing that you alluded to was that he made it clear that the government was determined to put economic recovery ahead of budget recovery. In other words, it wanted to get the economy going, and the measurement of that was unemployment back under 6% before it started to deal with deficit and debt. Now, that would look to be a fairly obvious proposition, not least because, of course, you need a strong economy to have a strong budget. But given that the coalition for years had this rhetoric about debt and deficit, I think the message was we continue to put ideology aside, as of course it has done with its support measures during COVID. But Josh Frydenberg is reinforcing that and is saying that the putting aside of ideology will continue to get the recovery.
And I assume that implies there'll be a series of announcements leading up to the 6th about spending, effectively putting money into the economy in different ways.
I think that the budget obviously will be a budget that spends a lot and that has, of course, as we know, an enormous deficit. And that big spending is despite the fact that JobKeeper and JobSeeker are starting now to be phased back, that they're not going to be as generous over the coming months. Just on the deficit, just before we started to talk, Josh Frydenberg had a news conference and he announced the outcome for the last financial year, and that's a deficit of around $85 billion. $85 billion. Big dollars.
That's a spectacular deficit.
It is, and we know that the one coming will be worse.
Yes, absolutely. And just, I think, moving on to these insolvency plans that the government's announced, this is clearly a mechanism to small businesses, and it's a process, as I understand it, about allowing small businesses to restructure their debt and then allowing them to trade whilst they're doing this restructure.
Right.
What's the purpose of this, and how's it being played out?
Well, the purpose is essentially to get some small businesses that would otherwise go under through this crisis, at least to give them a better chance of getting through and coming out the other side and being able to continue. Now, some won't make it, and the Reserve Bank Governor, for example, has foreshadowed some wave of business closures, but the government is trying to prop up those that do have a fighting chance of surviving in the longer term. The government has also this week announced a new credit regime which essentially makes it easier for people to obtain credit, home loans and so on, and to encourage the banks to be freer with credit. So there are essentially less checks in the system. The onus will be on the borrower to provide adequate and accurate information rather than on their lender to chase down every last detail. Now, this will be welcomed by some who've thought that the present system is too restrictive, but it does carry dangers, of course, that the banks are a bit sloppier in their scrutiny of potential borrowers, and that could lead to tears in the longer run.
And do you think this ability to trade out of insolvency during a recession is enough for small businesses?
It won't be enough for quite a few small businesses, but for ones on the margin, it will probably be helpful.
On Wednesday, former Prime Minister Paul Keating came out swinging against the Reserve Bank, and a bank I believe he said once notably that he had in his back pocket. And the Reserve Bank indicating they weren't doing enough and they weren't doing the right things in the corona context. Did he have a point?
Well, I guess it depends where you're coming from. His argument is that the bank should be doing more to help the government in its fiscal policy, and that what it's doing is sort of standing back and waiting and seeing and canvassing options. His outburst followed a speech by a senior official of the bank which did examine a number of things that the bank could do if the board decided more action on its part is needed. Of course, it's got interest rates really now down to almost rock bottom, and so its hands are tied to some extent. But Paul Keating just thinks that it should be much more forward-leaning and help the economic recovery more actively rather than taking a cautious role.
It seems to be a week for prime ministers having former prime ministers having a say. So this week as well, Malcolm Turnbull, a former Liberal prime minister, came out against the gas-led recovery and indicated his perspective that I think he said that it was a fantasy that we would have a clean energy boom. Does he have a point? What was he trying to indicate?
He was arguing that gas prices would not go down to the levels that the government is assuming, which would fuel, no pun intended, a gas-led recovery. And his point actually is reinforced by experts in the area who do doubt that the government's assumptions about lower prices are correct. Malcolm Turnbull is, of course, a very strong supporter of renewable energy, and he would think that in the government's energy measures that have been announced over the past couple of weeks, that renewables are not being given the prominence that they should. They've tended to be in the background against gas and the new technologies that the government is spruiking.
Yeah, and part of the conversations I heard during the week were the government believes that the renewable energy industry is actually performing well and doesn't need support from government. Is that?
Well, that's right, and what it's done is say that it will widen the remit of its clean energy agencies so that they will concentrate on investment in new technologies, emerging technologies, and not on renewables, in renewables.
And then finally this week, Communications Minister Paul Fletcher announced a multi-billion-dollar investment in NBN for fibre to the home, and I was around in Tasmania in the early days of NBN, and my understanding that was actually part of the original proposition. So Wasn't this funded before?
This has been, of course, a long saga. Labor's plan was to have fibre to the home, a very ambitious plan. The coalition government, which was elected in 2013, tore that up, or semi-tore it up, and said that it would have a much scaled down NBN, fibre to the node, street corner, rather than to the home, and use of the copper wire that was already there. Now, of course, the government is saying we'll scale up. We'll have fibre along the street. Homes that want to be connected can be connected, mind you, at a higher cost, quite a big cost, and they'll get faster broadband. Now, there are two ways of looking at this. The government said, oh, we always intended to start smaller and scale up, and this is what we're doing, and that was, they say, a more economic way to do it and a way to get broadband out faster. The opposition say, well, you're now just going to what we planned all along, and it just means that years have been lost. So you can take it whichever way you like.
And what's the motivation for this investment in fibre to the home at the moment? Is there something in the context of coronavirus and working from home?
Certainly, I think coronavirus has shown the importance of a very strong network. As you say, many people have been working from home, and even when it's all over, assuming it'll be all over sometime, quite a few people, I think, will stay working from home. So a better, faster system will be needed, and the government says that the financing is there, and therefore it's time to upgrade.
Well, as always, Michelle, a fascinating insight into the politics of the week. Thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you, Paddy. Next time we speak, I think it'll be post-budget.
Ah, yes, post-budget. It'll be really interesting to see the outcomes of that.
Thank you.